She came 3,000 miles on the strength of 10 words. She had been waiting for hours. And then she heard something. A stranger, coming from the dark. He did not ask her name. He did not ask who she was waiting for. He simply stopped.
The letters had been read so many times that the paper had gone soft, the creases worn deep as old scars. Willa Merritt kept them bound with a strip of blue grosgrain ribbon she had cut from the hem of her mother's Sunday dress, the last good thing her mother had owned before the fever took her 3 winters ago. 6 months of correspondence tied in that small, careful bow rested in her lap as the train carried her west through the dissolving world of everything she had ever known. She was 23 years old. She had the kind of face that people trusted without quite knowing why. Steady dark eyes set beneath a straight brow, a mouth that was quick to listen and slow to speak, hands that had been calloused since she was 14 by the looms of the Merritt Textile Works in Providence, Rhode Island. Her father's name on the building had meant nothing in the end. He had drunk the company into the ground before she turned 18, and the inheritance he left her was a talent for figures, a distrust of pretty words, and exactly enough money to purchase a second-class train ticket to Millbrook, Montana, with $11 remaining after the trunk fee. She had not cried when she left Providence. She had stood on the platform at the Providence station on the morning of the 7th of June, 1889, with her trunk checked into the luggage car and her reticule in her hands, and she had looked at the city she had lived in for her entire life, the church spires above the hill, the gray water of the river, the mill buildings rising in their solid smoke-stained rows, and she had felt something that was not quite sadness and not quite relief, but something in between, a kind of careful closing, the way you closed a door on a room you did not intend to enter again. The train had carried her west through Connecticut and into New York, and the first night she had sat up in the second-class carriage because she could not sleep, watching the darkness move outside the glass and thinking about what she was doing and deciding not to think about it, which was a skill she had developed over the years into something approaching art. She was good at not thinking about things until she had to. She was good at waiting. She had placed the advertisement herself. She had sat at the small writing desk in her rented room on Benefit Street for the better part of an evening in November, crossing out words and writing them again, trying to sound neither desperate nor cold, trying to find the register of a woman who was practical and serious, and who understood that what she was doing was a business arrangement as much as anything else, even if the arrangement was marriage. Young woman of good character and domestic capability seeks correspondence with an honest man of the West, with matrimony as the object. She had read it back to herself twice, made one final change crossing out capable and replacing it with capable, and then posted it to the National Gazette on a Tuesday morning, walked home through the first snow of the season with her boots leaving dark prints on the fresh white sidewalk, and told herself she felt nothing in particular about it. She had received 5 replies in the weeks that followed. She had read all of them carefully, the way she read everything with full attention and without the charity of wishful thinking. 4 of them she had set aside almost immediately. There was the man from Oregon who described his land holdings in such extravagant detail that she understood he was either lying or so in love with his own property that there would be no room for a wife in the picture. There was the widower from Kansas with 6 children who wanted someone to manage his household, which was honest enough, but not what she was looking for. There was a young man from Nevada whose handwriting was so erratic and whose sentences moved so unpredictably from topic to topic that she worried about the stability of his mind. And there was a man from Colorado who used the word love 3 times in his first letter, which told her he was performing rather than communicating. And performance was the thing she was most tired of, having grown up watching her father perform prosperity while the company collapsed around him. Harlan Vale had been the only reply she seriously considered. His letter had arrived 3 weeks after she placed the advertisement in a plain envelope, addressed in handwriting that was neither elegant nor careless, but something in between the script of a man who had learned to write for practical purposes and saw no reason to make it more than that. He introduced himself without flourish and without apology. He was 38 years old. He owned a cattle ranch outside Millbrook, Montana in the Bitterroot Valley. He had built most of the house himself over a period of 6 years, starting with 2 rooms and adding as the ranch became profitable enough to support expansion. The land was good land, he wrote, mountain grass and reliable water, the kind of property that rewarded work with results. He needed a wife, not an ornament. He needed a partner with a clear head and steady hands, someone who understood that the life he was offering was a working life, and who did not mistake that for a lesser thing. He was not, he concluded, a man given to exaggeration. That last line had done it. Every other letter she had received had been threaded through with a kind of breathless salesmanship, men presenting themselves the way an auctioneer presented livestock, all surface and superlative. Harlan Vale's letter had the quality of a hand placed flat on a table. Here is what I am. Here is what I have. Here is what I need. What do you say? It did not ask her to be impressed. It asked her to consider. She wrote back. The correspondence that followed over the next 6 months had the texture of a careful negotiation, each letter a little more specific than the last, each one adding a detail to the picture that was forming in her mind, the way a draftsman added lines to a drawing until the shape became unmistakable. He wrote about the seasons on the ranch, and she could hear in his descriptions the voice of a man who had paid close attention to the land for long enough that he knew its rhythms, the way she knew the rhythms of the loom room, the particular sounds that meant things were going right, and the particular sounds that meant trouble was coming. He wrote about calving season in late February with a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction that she recognized as a signature of someone who found their work genuinely meaningful. He wrote about the silence of the high country in August, about the heat and the creek running cold over its stones, about the quality of the light in the evenings when the mountains turn colors she said she would have to see to believe. He wrote about his cattle with a reserved, unsentimental affection that she found unexpectedly moving. He was not a man who wasted feeling on things that didn't deserve it, and so when feeling appeared in his writing, it had weight. And then in his third letter, he had answered her cautious question about the house. She had asked it carefully, not wanting to seem as though she was auditioning the property, but genuinely curious about the details of the daily life she was considering. He had answered most of her questions in his practical, methodical way: the distance from town, the number of rooms, the state of the kitchen, whether there was a good well. And then at the end of a paragraph about the kitchen, almost as an afterthought, he had written the sentence: "The kitchen window faces east. You will have the morning sun for your bread." She had read it and set the letter down and looked out her own window at the brick wall of the building next door and sat with the sentence for a long time. It was such a specific and particular thing to say. Not the kitchen is adequate or the kitchen has good light, but the kitchen window faces east, and you will have the morning sun for your bread. It was a sentence that contained a person, a woman at a kitchen window in the early morning with flour on her hands and the first light of the day coming in warm from the east. It was a sentence that assumed she would be there to receive the light. It assumed a future in which she was present and occupied and at home. It had entered her imagination like a key entering a lock, and something in her that had been closed for a very long time had opened around it. An east-facing window, the morning sun for her bread. In Providence, the sun was a ration thing. Her room on Benefit Street faced a brick wall. The windows of the textile works faced north by design because northern light was flat and consistent and diffuse and did not cause the workers to look up from their looms. She had lived the first 23 years of her life in a city that parceled out sunlight between tall buildings and smokestacks, and the promise of a kitchen window that faced east in the Montana morning had been, she understood now with the clarity of distance, the thing that had made Harlan Vale's letters feel less like correspondence and more like a country she already had a right to. She wrote back with more warmth than she had allowed herself in the earlier letters. She told him about Providence, about the mills, about her father's company, and what had happened to it. She did not dress it up or make it more or less than it was. She told him she knew how to work and that she was not afraid of it, and that she had been keeping accounts since she was 16 and could manage the financial records of a ranch if that would be useful. She told him she was 23 and in good health and that she had no other serious prospects, which was the truth. He wrote back within 2 weeks. He said he was glad she was practical about money because he was not, and the accounts needed attention. He said he had not expected her to still be writing to him after 4 months, and that he was glad she was. He said he would be at the Millbrook station to meet the afternoon train on the 10th of June, and that she would know him because he was tall and plain in dress, and he would be the one standing still while everyone else moved. She had read this last line several times. The one standing still while everyone else moved. It told her something about him that the rest of the letters had been building toward, without quite arriving at, and what it told her was that he was a man who knew himself well enough to know how he appeared in a crowd, and that this self-knowledge was accompanied by neither pride nor embarrassment, but simply by the steady neutrality of a man who had made his peace with being what he was. She wrote back and told him she would be on the train. She spent the months between January and June in a state that she could only describe as purposeful motion, selling the last of her father's books, which she had been keeping in a rented storage room and which had taken up space she could no longer afford, clearing her room on Benefit Street of everything she did not intend to take west, which turned out to be most of what she owned. She kept her mother's Bible. She kept her father's ledger books, the ones from the years when the company was solvent, because they were the only record she had of a time when her family had been something other than a cautionary tale. She kept her kitchen knives, which were good ones, bought with 3 months of savings when she was 19 and still believing that the quality of your tools was an investment worth making. She kept 2 good dresses and 1 work dress, and the pair of boots that had been resold twice and would last another winter. She packed it all into the full-size traveling trunk she had bought secondhand from the woman down the hall, who was moving in the opposite direction eastward toward a sister in Boston, and she had it sent to the station ahead of her departure date. She did not tell the women at the mill where she was going. She told Mrs. Farnsworth, who managed the floor, that she was leaving for family reasons, which was true enough in the sense that the absence of family was in fact the primary reason she was going. She worked her last day on a Friday in late May and walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk in the thin spring sunshine and felt the strange lightness of a person who has just put down something very heavy and is not yet sure if their arms remember how to carry nothing. It was now the 7th of June, 1889. The train had been 3 days into its journey and would arrive at Millbrook the following afternoon. Outside the second-class carriage window, the plains of Wyoming had given way to the first real mountain she had ever seen, rising out of the flat earth with a suddenness that was almost violent, as though the land had decided without warning to become something else entirely. She had been reading the letters again since morning. She had not reread them in sequence since January, and she found herself wanting to read them from the beginning, the way you read a map before entering unfamiliar territory, verifying that you understood the route before you committed to taking it. She read slowly. The carriage rocked in its steady, hypnotic rhythm. A child 3 rows ahead was conducting a patient, repetitive negotiation with its mother about something she couldn't quite hear. The mountains outside grew taller and more complicated, their lower slopes dark with timber, their upper faces bare and gray and indifferent. She read through the December letter and the January letter and the February letter, following the thread of the correspondence forward, watching the careful edifice they had built together, letter by letter, over 6 months. She was midway through the March letter when she stopped. She went back 2 sentences. Read the passage again. In the March letter describing the physical layout of the ranch, Harlan had written a paragraph about the water situation, which was, as she had learned from reading enough of his letters, a subject of genuine importance on any Western ranch. The creek runs down from the north pasture he had written, cutting east along the property line before it bends toward the lower meadow. She had read this before and had formed from it a mental picture of the ranch's geography, the north pasture higher up the creek, coming down from it, the lower meadow where it bent. She could see it in her mind. She had been seeing it for months. She turned to the May letter. The creek is the best thing about the property, he had written in a passage near the middle of the letter one. She had read many times. It runs from the west side of the upper ridge, clear and cold, even in the worst of August, never drops below a good flow, even in drought years. She had read this and thought about the cold, clear water in the drought years, and had understood it as evidence of the ranch's reliability, which was the thing she was most hoping for. She sat with both passages open on her lap. The creek runs down from the north pasture. It runs from the west side of the upper ridge. From the north in March, from the west in May. A creek did not run from two directions. A man did not forget which direction his own creek ran. A man who had been on a piece of land for 6 years and had built a house on it and described the water situation in his letters as a point of pride and reliability did not write north in March and west in May by accident. The directions were not interchangeable. They were not approximately the same. North and west were different directions. A creek was not a theoretical proposition. It ran where the land made it run, and a man who knew his land knew where his water came from. Unless he did not know his land. Unless the land was something he had assembled from imagination or from someone else's description, or from the kind of sentimental frontier novel that was sold in train stations for 25 cents and recycled the same romantic geography, the cold creek, the high pasture, the morning light through the kitchen window. Willa sat very still as the carriage rocked around her. The mountains outside were growing, and the child ahead had finally stopped its negotiations and fallen asleep, and the afternoon light was changing as the train moved into the shadow of a long ridge. She looked at both letters open on her lap and understood that she had been looking at a flaw that had been there all along, waiting to be seen by someone who was paying sufficient attention. She had been paying attention. She had been paying careful, serious attention for 6 months. She had read every letter more than once, had considered every detail, had asked sensible questions and received sensible answers, and had decided on the basis of all of it that this was a man she could trust. And she had missed this. A detail in March that contradicted a detail in May. A creek that ran from two directions. She gathered the letters slowly, smoothed each one with the flat of her hand, and retied the ribbon in its careful bow. Her hands were very steady. She noted this steadiness with a kind of remote admiration, as though observing the hands of a stranger who was behaving with more composure than the situation perhaps warranted. She looked out the window at the mountains. She was still 23 years old. She still had the kind of face people trusted. She was still on a train heading west with a trunk in the luggage car and $11 in her reticule and a letter in the bottom of her bag telling her to look for a tall man, plain in dress, who would be standing still while everyone else moved. She had no way to stop what was already in motion. The train did not stop at places between stops, and the will of a young woman from Providence, Rhode Island, however clear-eyed and however steady, her hands did not constitute a reason to make an exception. She thought about the sentence. The kitchen window faces east. You will have the morning sun for your bread. She thought about the creek that ran from the north in March and from the west in May. She thought about the quality of hope she had been carrying for 6 months, the way it had felt in her chest through the long winter warm and specific and almost like certainty. She thought about how rarely she had allowed herself to feel certainty about anything, and how when she finally did, she had chosen to feel it about this. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the mountains and told herself what she had told herself many times in the years since her parents died. There was no use in feeling a thing before you had to. The feeling would come. It always came eventually, but not yet. Not while there was still a chance she was wrong about what she thought she knew, and not while the train was moving and there was nothing she could do about any of it, regardless. She was still looking at the mountains when the sun went behind the ridge and the carriage fell into a long, cool shadow, and the child ahead stirred in its sleep and made a small questioning sound, and the mother murmured something quiet and specific, and the child was still. The train pulled into Millbrook at 4:37 in the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1889, the brakes complaining against the rails in a long metallic shriek that brought the remaining passengers to attention and sent hands reaching for bags and hats. Willa had been watching the town assemble itself through the window for the last quarter of an hour. A water tower first appearing above the line of the valley like a sentinel. Then the dark smudge of a smithy's smoke. Then the scattered rooftops of buildings along a main street that was unpaved and pale with summer dust in the afternoon glare. It was smaller than she had imagined. She had known intellectually that Millbrook would be small. She had read about Montana towns in the newspapers and in a travel pamphlet she had found in the Providence Library, and she had understood that the settlements of the high country were not cities or even proper towns in the eastern sense, but more like thickenings of the landscape at points where commerce and geography had briefly coincided. She had understood this, but understanding a thing and seeing it were two different operations, and seeing Millbrook for the first time, the dozen or so buildings, the single main street, the mountains pressing in from every direction, as if the town were something the land was tolerating rather than celebrating, produced a sensation in her chest that was more complicated than simple disappointment. She stepped down from the carriage onto the raw lumber of the platform, which smelled of new wood and hot sun, and the particular mineral dryness of mountain air. The platform ran the length of two freight cars and ended at a small station house with its windows shuttered against the afternoon heat. There was a hand-painted sign, Millbrook, Montana, the letters uneven but committed, done by someone who had wanted to be legible rather than decorative. There was a wooden bench with one leg shorter than the others propped on a flat stone. There was a water trough and a hitching post, and at the far end of the platform a stack of freight crates waiting for collection. There were perhaps 15 other passengers disembarking. A family with an excess of children and luggage, the parents moving with the practiced, slightly desperate efficiency of people managing too many things at once. A man in a good suit who had the look of someone who made this journey regularly and found it unremarkable. Two ranch hands who had spent the trip in the front of the carriage playing cards and who now walked off toward the saloon down the street without looking back or breaking their conversation. Willa stood on the platform and waited for a tall man, plain in dress, who would be standing still. The passengers dispersed. The family was absorbed by a waiting wagon. The suited man found his contact at the far end of the platform and departed without ceremony. The freight was claimed by a boy with a handcart who appeared from the direction of the general store and went about his work with the focused indifference of someone performing a task he had performed many times before. The platform was empty. The train, which had been resting with the massive, patient stillness of something very large that has decided to stop moving, shuddered once and began to pull away. The whistle sounded one long cry that went out across the valley and returned diminished from the mountains, a smaller, lonelier sound. And then the train was gone, and the silence that replaced it was total, in the way that the silence of high country was always total, not merely the absence of sound, but the presence of something very large and very indifferent. She sat on the bench with the prop leg. She set her reticule in her lap and her hands on top of the reticule and looked at the main street of Millbrook, the general store, the saloon, a building that might have been a hotel or a boarding house, the church at the far end with its modest steeple pointing at the enormous sky, and she waited. He was late, that was all. A horse could throw a shoe, a calf could breach a fence, an axle could crack on a mountain road. 100 practical and sensible things could delay a man who ran a cattle ranch 5 miles from town on a working day in June. She was good at waiting. She had been waiting in one form or another for most of her life, waiting for her father to stop drinking, waiting for the mill to close as everyone knew it eventually would, waiting for some circumstance to shift in a direction that would allow her to do something other than the thing she was already doing. She was practiced at it. She knew how to sit still and breathe steadily and let time move at whatever pace it intended to move. The sun moved. The shadows on the platform grew long and shifted their angle and changed from the crisp shadows of afternoon to the softer, more amber shadows of approaching evening. The air, which had been warm when the train arrived, began to carry a chill from somewhere higher up that had nothing to do with clouds and everything to do with altitude. She pulled her traveling shawl closer around her shoulders. She watched the main street, which was not busy at this hour, a woman crossing from the general store to the building opposite carrying a paper parcel, 2 men talking in front of the saloon without apparent urgency, a dog sleeping in the road at an angle that suggested it had simply stopped there and not been able to think of a reason to get up. The station agent came out at dusk. He was a stooped man with a tired face and the manner of someone who had been doing the same job for long enough that it no longer required his full attention. He came out of the station house with a ring of keys at his belt, locked the door behind him, glanced at her on the bench, with a quick, unseeing look of someone noting an obstacle rather than a person, tipped his hat in a gesture so economical it was barely a gesture at all, and walked off down the dusty road toward the lights of the town, which were beginning to appear now in the windows of the buildings one by one as the evening settled in. She was alone on the platform. The first star appeared above the mountains to the east, a single bright point against the deepening blue so clear and close in the high-altitude air that it seemed almost within reach. Then another and another until the sky above Millbrook was full of them, a density of stars she had never seen in Providence, where the mills burned through the night and the sky glowed orange with the aggregate light of the city, and the stars were faint and apologetic things barely visible above the rooftops. These stars were different. They were bright and hard and numerous, the sky between them genuinely dark in a way that urban skies never were, and under other circumstances, she might have found them very beautiful. He was not coming. The thought arrived without drama, without the rush of a realization, but with the quiet physical certainty of something that had always been true and had simply been waiting for her to stop arguing with it. It settled into her stomach like a stone dropped into cold water. He was not coming. She had been sitting on this platform for 3 hours, and the sun had set, and the stars had come out, and he was not coming. She was in Millbrook, Montana, alone with a trunk in the station luggage room and a reticule containing $11 and 6 months of correspondence that she was now understanding with the specific clarity that darkness and cold and the total silence of an empty platform provided were not what they had appeared to be. A creek that ran from 2 directions, a man who was not coming, the architecture of a life built on paper by a man she had never met, for purposes she was only beginning to understand. She did not cry. She noticed the absence of tears with the same remote, almost clinical quality with which she had noticed the steadiness of her hands on the train, as though she were observing herself from a slight distance and finding the observations interesting. She was not at this moment a woman who cried. She was a woman who sat very straight on a bench with a propped leg on an empty platform in the dark and tried to think clearly about what was true and what needed to be done next. What was true, she was alone in a place she did not know. What was true, she had $11. What was true, she was 23 years old and in good health, and she had been managing difficult situations with insufficient resources for the better part of a decade. And whatever this was, it was a difficult situation with insufficient resources, and she had practice with those. What needed to be done, she needed to find somewhere to sleep. She was still organizing these thoughts when she heard the hooves. They came from the north end of town, slow and deliberate, the sound of an animal that had covered distance and was not being hurried. Then the sound of a second animal, heavier with a slightly uneven gait, a pack mule she would come to understand, loaded with supplies from a long day's run into town. The sounds came down the main street and turned toward the platform, and then stopped, and in the silence that followed, she heard the soft creak of saddle leather and the faint percussion of metal on metal bridle rings settling. She looked toward the sound. A man on horseback had stopped at the edge of the platform. He was leading the mule on a rope. In the starlight, she could make out his shape broad through the shoulder solid in the saddle, the brim of his hat pulled low over his face. He sat his horse the way men sat horses when riding had been part of their life, since before conscious memory, without thought, without adjustment, the way a person stood on solid ground without thinking about balance. It was the posture of someone for whom this was not an activity, but simply a condition of being. He was looking at her. She did not look away. She had learned in the years since her father's decline that looking away from things was a luxury she could not afford. They regarded each other across the short distance of the platform for a long moment, and then he swung down from the saddle in one smooth, unhurried movement, looped his reins over the platform railing, and walked toward her. His boots made a soft, measured sound on the wooden boards. As he came closer and the starlight gave her more of him, she saw a face that was neither young nor old, weathered by years of outdoor work into something angular and particular, with lines at the corners of his eyes that were not laugh lines exactly, but the lines of a man who had spent a long time looking at distances. He was perhaps late 30s, possibly 40. He carried himself without any of the performed confidence she had learned to recognize in men who wanted to be perceived as significant. He moved the way the mountains looked as if the question of how he appeared to others had simply never occurred to him. He stopped a few feet from her. He looked at her trunk, at her reticule, at the empty platform stretching behind her, at the locked door of the station house. He did not say, "What are you doing here?" He did not say, "Are you all right?" He seemed to understand with the efficiency of a man who was good at reading situations that both questions were answerable by observation, and that the answers were not ones she would necessarily want to put into words. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone roughened at the edges by wind and outdoor living, not unkind. "Last train's been and gone." "I know," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. She noted this and was annoyed by it and kept her expression even. He looked at her for another moment, steadily, assessingly, without the quality of intrusion. He was taking stock of the situation the way a practical man took stock of a problem, looking for the relevant facts. "Town's a fair walk," he said. "There's a boarding house. Mrs. Aldrich runs it. Clean place. Good woman." He did not ask her name. He did not ask who she had been waiting for or why they had not come. These were not questions it was his place to ask, and he seemed to understand this without being told. "My trunk," she said. He looked at the trunk. It was a full-size traveling trunk, banded in brass, the kind that weighed close to 60 pounds when full, and it was full. He looked at the mule, which was already laden with his own supplies. He considered the situation briefly. "I can take it on the mule," he said. "Redistribute some of the load." "Thank you," she said. And then, because it seemed like the kind of thing that mattered, one solid fact in a situation that had become short on them, "My name is Willa Merritt." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Brief interior, a small adjustment, like a door opening an inch and then being held carefully in place. It was not an expression exactly, not something she could have named or described to another person, but it was there and she saw it and she filed it away without yet understanding what it meant. "Samuel Briggs," he said. He went to the trunk and took its weight with a matter-of-fact ease that suggested the strength of a man who moved heavy things regularly and had long ago stopped finding it notable. He carried it to the mule, rearranged the existing load with a few practiced movements, secured the trunk with a length of rope using knots that she could tell even in the dark were correct and efficient. He tested the load once with both hands and then took the mule's lead rope and his horse's reins in one hand and started walking toward the main street. She fell into step beside him. They walked in silence. It was not the silence of two people who have exhausted their conversation or who are uncomfortable in each other's company. It was the silence of a situation that had not yet found the words appropriate to it, and there was something almost restful in the shared understanding that words were not at this moment what was needed. The main street of Millbrook was quiet in the evening. Most of its commerce finished for the day, a lamp burning in the window of the general store where someone was working late, the sound of a piano from the saloon carrying thinly in the still air, the dogs still asleep in the road, making no concession to their passing. The dust was fine and pale, and their footsteps raised small, slow clouds of it that drifted in the windless dark. She thought about what she had just done, accepting the guidance of a stranger in an unfamiliar place in the dark, and tried to locate the fear that should have accompanied this, and found that she could not. There was something about Samuel Briggs's silence that was not the silence of concealment, but the silence of a man who did not speak unless he had something to say. And she found this after 6 months of letters that she was now understanding had been full of words arranged to create an impression rather than to convey a truth, a kind of profound relief. The boarding house was 2 blocks from the station, a 2-story frame building set slightly back from the street with a wide covered porch and a lantern burning beside the front door. A painted sign on the gate read, "Aldrich Rooms." There were window boxes along the porch railing with something growing in them. She couldn't tell what in the dark, only that they were tended and green and that someone had thought to put them there. Samuel stopped at the gate. He untied her trunk from the mule and set it on the porch steps with the same easy, unremarked strength with which he had loaded it. The front door opened before either of them moved toward it. The woman who appeared was stout and gray-haired, with the kind of face that had once been conventionally pretty and had over the years become something more useful. Sharp, dark eyes, a strong jaw, an expression of calm, comprehensive competence. She wore an apron over a plain dark dress, and her hair was pinned back with the pragmatic efficiency of a woman who had more important things to think about than her hair. "Mr. Briggs." Her voice was dry and measured, a voice accustomed to being listened to. "Wasn't expecting you until the end of the month." "Mrs. Aldrich." He nodded toward Willa. "This lady needs a room." Mrs. Aldrich looked at Willa with the practiced, thorough appraisal of a woman who had been assessing arriving travelers for long enough to be very good at it. She took in the traveling dress that had been worn for 3 days, the reticule held with the slightly excessive firmness of someone maintaining a grip on the one thing they had left to hold on to, the posture that was still correct past the point where correctness should have failed. "Of course," she said, not warmly, not coldly, simply with the matter-of-fact competence of a woman who had made a business of providing what people needed and who extended that provision without sentimentality. Willa turned to Samuel Briggs. In the light from the doorway, she could see his face with more clarity than the starlight had allowed, and she thought again that it was a face that rewarded looking not handsome in the conventional easy sense, but the kind of face that became more fully itself, the longer you looked at it, as though it had been made for the long view rather than the first impression. "Thank you, Mr. Briggs," she said. "I am in your debt." He did not deflect this with the practiced dismissiveness that some men use to avoid the discomfort of being thanked. He received it simply with a slight nod, as he received most things. Then he spoke to Mrs. Aldrich. "Put her first week on my account." Willa opened her mouth. "I insist," she said. "I know you do," he said, not unkindly, just accurately. He touched the brim of his hat, the minimal, definitive gesture of a man whose social courtesies were real but brief, gathered his horse's reins in the mule's lead in one hand, and walked back the way they had come, back down the quiet street toward the north end of town, his footsteps fading into the sound of the hooves until there was nothing but the piano from the saloon and the dog in the road and the lamp beside Mrs. Aldrich's door. Willa stood on the porch for a moment after he was gone. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she could feel them, the weight and presence of them, the way a large thing in a dark room made itself known not by sight, but by the way it displaced the air. They were out there in every direction, enormous and patient, and the sky above them was so full of stars it looked almost architectural, as though someone had built it and meant it. She thought about the creek that ran from the north in March and from the west in May. She thought about the east-facing window, the morning sun for your bread. She picked up her reticule, went inside, and let Mrs. Aldrich close the door behind her. The room was on the second floor at the front of the house, small and impeccably clean. A narrow iron bed with a white coverlet, a washstand with a blue and white pitcher and bowl, the basin wiped dry, the towel folded precisely over the rail, a braided rug in faded colors on the pine floor, and a window she crossed to it before she sat down. Before she did anything else, a window that faced east, out over the rooftops of Millbrook's main street, toward the dark shapes of the lower hills behind which the sun would rise in the morning. She stood at the window for a long time, long enough for her eyes to adjust fully to the dark outside, and for her to be able to see or to imagine. She could see the particular depth of darkness to the east. That meant the land was lower there, that the mountains gave way to valley. In that direction, that the sun would find a relatively clear path when it came. Then she went to the bed and sat on its edge, and let the control she had been holding all day on the train on the platform, walking through the dark streets, go. The tears came quietly. She made no sound. She cried the way she did everything, with full attention, and without waste, the way someone cried who knew from experience that crying was a finite thing, that it would end, and that she would still be herself when it did. She was not crying for Harlan Vale. She understood somewhere in the still clear part of herself that persisted even now that she was not grieving a man she had never met and did not know. She was crying for the girl who had sat at a small writing desk on Benefit Street in November and had composed an advertisement with the quiet desperation of someone who had run out of other options and had chosen to call it hope. She was crying for the quality of certainty she had felt when she read the sentence about the east-facing window, the warmth of it, the specific comfort of a future that suddenly had a shape. She was crying because she had been careful. She had been so careful. She had read the letters and asked practical questions and looked for inconsistencies and thought about what it meant that a man described himself in a particular way. She had been as careful as she knew how to be, and a creek had run from 2 directions, and she had not caught it until she was 3 days into a journey she could not undo. When it was over, she washed her face in the blue and white basin, the water cold and immediate and good, the kind of cold that clarified rather than numbed. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The same face, the dark eyes a little quieter now, the set of the mouth a little more careful. She dried her hands on the clean towel. She braided her hair. She took the letters from her reticule and placed them in the bottom of her trunk without looking at them. She did not put the letters in the trunk with regret or ceremony. She put them there because they were paper, and paper was evidence, and evidence had its uses, and it was not yet clear what use they might be. Tomorrow she would think about what came next. She was good at figures. She was good at order. She was good at making something coherent out of something that had been allowed to become a mess. These were not small capabilities. These were the things that had kept her fed and housed and functional in Providence, when everything around her was declining, and they would keep her fed and housed and functional here in Millbrook, Montana, on the far side of the continent from everything she had ever known, because they were the kind of capacities that worked regardless of geography. Tonight she would sleep. She lay down on the narrow bed with the white coverlet and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the new place arranging themselves around her. A horse somewhere to the north, the piano from the saloon going through its limited repertoire, the creak of the house settling in the mountain cold. Small sounds, specific sounds. The sounds of a real place with a real sky above it going about its own business with complete indifference to the hopes and plans of young women from Providence, Rhode Island. Through the east-facing window, the stars moved in their long, slow arc across the Montana sky. The same stars that had been there before she arrived. The same stars that would be there after everything she thought she knew had changed completely. She was still there when morning came, and the window did indeed face east, and the light that came through it in the first hour after dawn was exactly what light through an east-facing window in high country always was: unhurried, factual. The light of a world that did not yet know what the day would make of it. The week passed in the way that difficult weeks passed when a person had decided not merely to endure them, but to use them. Willa came downstairs each morning before 6, which was when Mrs. Aldrich came into the kitchen, and she helped with the breakfast dishes without being asked, and swept the front porch when she saw that it needed sweeping because occupation was better than the alternative, and because she had learned long ago that making yourself useful was the fastest way to establish yourself as someone worth keeping. Mrs. Aldrich did not ask questions. This was, Willa came to understand, not a failure of curiosity. The woman's eyes missed nothing. And what they saw, they filed away with the efficiency of someone who had been storing and cross-referencing information about other people for many decades. But a deliberate professional courtesy extended to women who arrived at her door in circumstances that did not invite inquiry. She provided the room and the meals and the morning coffee and the afternoon silence, and she did not pry, and Willa was profoundly grateful for it, in a way she suspected she would not have been able to articulate even if asked. In the afternoons after the dishes were cleared and the room set in order, Willa sat in the small parlor off the kitchen and worked on Mrs. Aldrich's accounts, which the older woman had been keeping with more goodwill than accuracy. It was not complicated work. The boarding house was not a complicated operation, but it had been allowed to accumulate errors in the way that accounts accumulated errors when the person responsible for them was better at other things, and Willa worked through the errors one by one with the focused, slightly compulsive pleasure she had always taken in making numbers do what they were supposed to do. Numbers were honest in a way that letters were not. A figure either corresponded to reality or it did not. A column either balanced or it didn't, and if it didn't, there was always a reason. And the reason was always discoverable if you were willing to look carefully and without the distortion of wishful thinking. She found the work of the accounts, the clean, absolute honesty of arithmetic, a kind of relief so profound it was almost physical. On the third morning, Mrs. Aldrich set a cup of coffee beside her elbow without comment, which Willa understood to be the woman's version of a warm endorsement. She saw Samuel Briggs once during that week. It was a Wednesday morning, and she was at the front window of the parlor, not watching the street particularly, but aware of it in the peripheral way you were aware of things outside when you were working inside. He came into town on the gray horse, moving at the unhurried walk of a man who was not in a hurry because he was always exactly where he meant to be, and he tied the horse in front of the general store and went inside without looking in the direction of the boarding house. He was inside for perhaps 20 minutes. When he came out, he had 2 wrapped packages under his arm and a coil of fence wire over his shoulder, and he secured these to the saddle with the quick, assured movements of a man for whom this was routine, and he mounted and rode back the way he had come. He did not look toward the boarding house. She watched him until the gray horse and its rider disappeared around the bend at the north end of the main street, and then she looked back at Mrs. Aldrich's accounts and found the column she had been working on and continued with it, and she did not examine, at least not directly, what it meant that she had been watching him at all. On the 7th morning, she came downstairs to find him in the front parlor. He was standing at the window facing into the room, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the habitual, slightly restless motion of a man who was making himself be still when stillness did not come naturally to him. The morning light came in through the parlor window from the east and fell across his face and the angles of it, and in that light she saw what she had not been able to fully see on the platform in the dark, the particular quality of his face, the way it was entirely without performance. There was no layer of presentation between what he looked like and what he was. This was rarer than it ought to have been. He turned when she came in with the alert, unhurried attention of a man who had heard her on the stairs and had been expecting her. His expression was the same as it had been on the platform, careful, directed at her, with the full, undivided quality of a man who had not learned to distribute his attention in small amounts to many things at once. "Miss Merritt," he said. "Mr. Briggs." Mrs. Aldrich had positioned herself in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel and the expression of a woman who was engaged in something that required her complete attention and happened to be located very close to where an interesting conversation was taking place. Samuel Briggs did not sit. He held his hat and looked at her and said what he had come to say with the directness of someone who had settled on the way here exactly how much introduction was warranted and concluded the answer was very little. "Mrs. Aldrich tells me you have a good head for figures," he said. Willa glanced at Mrs. Aldrich, who continued to be thoroughly occupied with her dish towel. "I am competent," Willa said. "I am not," he said. The admission arrived without ceremony and without embarrassment, not false modesty and not genuine humiliation, but simply the flat, accurate reporting of a fact, the way you told someone the well was 50 feet deep or the north fence needed a new post. It was information, nothing more and nothing less. I have 3 years of ranch accounts that have been managed the way accounts are managed by a man who knows he's bad at accounts and has no one to share the problem with. Receipts in boxes, figures on scraps of paper, whole months with nothing written down at all. He paused. He was looking at her with the steady, direct attention she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things that mattered. "It needs someone who can make sense of it." "How much sense does it need to be made of?" she asked. He considered this for a moment with the seriousness he apparently brought to all questions that deserve serious answers. "Considerable," he said. She thought about her trunk upstairs and the $11 in her reticule, and the further dollar and some cents remaining after she had bought herself a length of ribbon and a bar of soap, which were necessities and not extravagances. She thought about the fact that Mrs. Aldrich's charity extended through Samuel Briggs's account could not continue indefinitely without becoming something she was not willing for it to become. She thought about Millbrook's main street, and the general store, and the saloon, and the church, and the total absence of anything that resembled an employment opportunity for a young woman with her particular skills. "What are the terms?" she asked. He named a wage. It was fair more than fair. It was the wage of someone who understood that the work was skilled and that skilled work had a value independent of the circumstances of the person performing it, and that if he set the price too low in order to take advantage of her situation, he would be doing something he did not intend to do. He would pay her board at Mrs. Aldrich's through the duration of the work. There was a room off the main house she could use as a workspace, small but with a window and a desk. "Yes," she said. The word came out with more force than she had intended, a force that surprised her slightly, and she saw him notice it. A brief attention, a noting of the force of the word, not surprised exactly, but present to it in the way he was present to everything. "I'll send the wagon Thursday morning," he said. He put on his hat. He left. Mrs. Aldrich came out of the kitchen doorway and poured herself a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the empty street and said nothing, which was, Willa had come to understand over the past week, her way of saying a great deal. The ranch was 5 miles north of town, reached by a road that followed the creek valley east from the main street before turning north into a fold of the mountains that wasn't visible from town. The wagon ride took 40 minutes on a road that was serviceable but not comfortable, and Willa spent most of it looking at the country she was passing through, the sage-covered slopes, the stands of fir and pine on the higher ground, the creek running alongside the road through thickets of willow brush, cold and clear and fast over its stones. She looked at the creek and thought about north and west and let the thought be what it was without embellishment. The ranch house came into view as the wagon rounded a long bend in the road, a low, solid structure built of hewn logs with pale mortar in the joints, a wide covered porch running the full length of the front, a barn behind it and 2 smaller outbuildings, a corral with several horses fencing running in clean lines up the slope of the hill to the north. The whole property had the quality of something built by someone who intended it to last, not picturesque, not trying to be, but tight and square, and made to the land it sat on. Samuel was on the porch when the wagon arrived. He showed her the workspace, a room off the side of the main house that had been recently cleared of the accumulated tack and hardware and boxes that had filled it, leaving enough space for the desk and chair he had moved in and the 2 wooden crates that sat beside the desk. A window on the east wall, morning light. She noticed it without saying anything about it. "Not much," he said, looking at the room. "It will do," she said, and meant it. He showed her the well, the kitchen, the outhouse, the places she would need to know about if she was to spend her days here. He said these things in the manner of someone completing a necessary checklist, neither welcoming nor unwelcoming, just thorough. Then he put his hat on and went back to work, and she sat down at the desk and opened the first crate. He had not overstated the situation. 3 years of ranch accounts in the hands of a man who was, as he had said without embarrassment, not competent at accounts, was a particular and specific kind of disaster. It was not the chaos of carelessness or indifference she could see that he had tried repeatedly, and with real effort had organized and reorganized, had started fresh systems and abandoned them, had done his best with a set of tools that were simply not the right tools for the job. The disaster was the disaster of a sincere person attempting work they were constitutionally unsuited for, and there was something almost poignant about it. The accumulated evidence of a capable man trying and failing at the one task his capable mind was not built to perform. She opened the fresh ledger she had brought in her trunk, sharpened her pen on the small whetstone she carried in her work bag, and began. The first morning passed in total silence, except for the scratch of her pen and the sounds that came from outside horses in the corral, the rhythmic impact of something being fixed somewhere behind the barn, the occasional exchange between Samuel and one of the 2 ranch hands who worked the property. He did not come to check on her. He did not look in at the door. He had hired her to do a job, and he was apparently content to let her do it without supervision, which was a more intelligent approach than many employers took, and which she appreciated in the precise professional way she appreciated effective management. The second morning she arrived to find a tin cup of coffee on the corner of her desk. It was hot and black, and there was no note, and there was no one in the workspace or the immediately adjacent area. She drank it. It was very good coffee, not the adequate serviceable coffee of the boarding house, but the coffee of someone who had been making coffee for themselves for long enough to have developed strong views about it and the skill to act on those views. The third morning it was there again. She did not thank him. He did not mention it. By the fourth morning, she understood that the coffee was not a gesture that required acknowledgement. It was simply a fact, like the desk in the east-facing window and the sound of the creak she could hear faintly from the open door on warm afternoons. It was there. It would be there tomorrow. It was as reliable as arithmetic. The weeks passed. The chaos in the crates resolved slowly and then more quickly as she developed a thorough understanding of the categories and periods and the particular idiosyncrasies of his record-keeping in each of the 3 years she was working through. She established a consistent taxonomy, first mapping every kind of expense and income onto a system that would hold across all 3 years, and then she worked backward through each year, separately building a clean, accurate picture before attempting to connect them. She worked with the particular focused quality of attention she brought to everything. She did not fast, not showy, but thorough and exact in accumulating toward clarity, the way a long journey accumulated toward its destination, one careful mile at a time. In the afternoon, she was aware of him on the porch. He worked there sometimes in the later part of the day after the heaviest ranch work was done, sitting in the chair closest to the railing with whatever needed repairing or maintaining, a length of bridle leather, a harness buckle, a pair of boots. The 1,000 small items that a working ranch generated in constant need of attention. She could see a portion of the porch through the doorway of her workspace, and she found herself, without deciding, to noting the rhythm of his presence there, the way he moved, the economy of it. Nothing wasted, each task completed in the most direct way available. His hands always busy with something specific. She noticed his hands particularly. They were never fully still. When he was not working on something practical, he was turning something over between his fingers, a piece of wood, most often a smooth stone occasionally. The hands of a man whose mind ran constantly and whose hands needed something to do while it ran. 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, she arrived on a Thursday morning to find beside the coffee cup on the corner of her desk a small carved figure. It was a meadowlark, perhaps 3 inches tall, cut from a pale, close-grained wood she didn't recognize. The work was extraordinary, the head tilted to one side as if the bird had just heard something worth paying attention to. The wing feathers articulated with delicate parallel cuts, the feet gripping a branch that had been suggested rather than fully realized, which somehow made the figure more alive than a complete perch would have done. It was not the work of someone experimenting with a new skill. It was the work of someone who had been doing this for a long time and had developed through long private practice a real mastery that had no audience and required none. She was still holding it, turning it in the morning light from the east window, when she heard his boot on the threshold. "My hands get restless," he said from the doorway. He said it in the tone of a man providing a factual explanation rather than seeking a response, as if the carved bird were a problem he was accounting for rather than a thing he had made and given to another person. She looked at the meadowlark and then at him. "It's beautiful," she said. The back of his neck reddened above his collar. It happened quickly, and he was already turning to go, and she thought that if she had not been paying the specific kind of attention she had developed for him, she would have missed it entirely. He went out to the corral without another word. She set the meadowlark on the corner of her desk beside the coffee cup and went back to the ledgers. But every time she looked up from the numbers, the small carved bird was there with its head tilted, apparently listening to something just out of earshot, and she found its presence on the corner of her desk a steadier comfort than she was entirely prepared for. It was on a Tuesday morning in the last week of July that she found the letters. She was working through the bottom of the second crate. The oldest records, the documents from 1885 and into 1886, which were the most disorganized of everything she had encountered, because they were the oldest, and because the system she had deduced from the later years had not yet been in effect when these were accumulated. Her hand sorting through a stack of papers at the very bottom found an envelope that was different from the receipts and invoices that surrounded it. The ranch papers were all on the cheap utilitarian paper that came in bulk from the general store, thin and slightly rough and always a little faded. This envelope was better quality, cream-colored, heavier, with a return address from Sweetwater County in another part of the state. She turned it over. It had been opened. She almost put it back. It was not a financial document, and it had no proper place in the ledger she was constructing. She had a policy, working through other people's records, of looking only at what was relevant to the financial picture she was building. But the name on the envelope stopped her. She did not pick up the name immediately. She read past it, and then her eyes went back the way eyes went back when they had caught something the conscious mind had not yet processed. Harlan Vale. The return address on the envelope that had been sent to the Briggs Ranch in the spring of 1885 was from a land brokerage office in Sweetwater County, and it referred to a transaction involving a party named Harlan Vale. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was from the land broker. It confirmed in the formal and careful language of legal correspondence a transaction in which Harlan Vale had agreed to purchase 40 acres of grazing land adjacent to the Briggs property's north boundary, with payment to be completed in 3 installments over 90 days. The letter was a confirmation of agreement, the kind sent to both parties as a record. She looked through the papers around it. There were 3 more letters from the same office, each a little more formally worded than the last, each noting with increasing precision that the agreed payment had not been received first, the initial installment, then the second, then the entirety of the remaining balance. The 4th letter was from a different source. The sheriff's office in Sweetwater County, noting that the party referred to as Harlan Vale had been unable to be located and that the matter was being closed, as the amount in question did not merit further expenditure of law enforcement resources. She laid the 4 letters out on the desk in sequence and read through them again. Harlan Vale had come to the Millbrook area 4 years ago in 1885, when Samuel Briggs was 29 and running a ranch that was, from the evidence of that period's accounts, doing reasonably but not spectacularly, and had entered into an agreement to purchase adjacent land. He had apparently never paid for it. He had either never intended to pay for it or had intended to pay and then found he could not, and in either case he had resolved the situation the same way, by disappearing. Samuel Briggs had known the name Harlan Vale. She sat with this. She thought back to the platform, to the moment she had said the name, and she saw again clearly now that she was looking for it, the brief interior adjustment in his face, the door opening a fraction and being held. She had not known what it meant at the time. She knew now. He had recognized the name the moment she spoke it, and he had said nothing, and he had picked up her trunk and walked her to the boarding house and paid for her room, and he had said nothing. She picked up the 4 letters, squared the edges, and carried them to the porch. He was there, as he often was, in the middle of the afternoon, working on a length of harness with an awl, the leather draped across his knee. He looked up when he heard her come out. He saw the letters in her hand. He set the awl on the porch railing and waited with the complete, unhurried stillness of a man who was prepared to receive whatever was coming. "You knew him," she said. It was not a question. He did not treat it as one. "Yes," he said. "Before I arrived." "Yes. You knew who I was waiting for on that platform." He looked at her directly. She had come to understand only one mode of eye contact, and it was complete. "The moment you said the name." The mountain wind came through the pines on the upper slope and moved the grass in the corral and carried with it the smell of pine resin and something cleaner underneath, something that was just the smell of high-altitude air, which had no equivalent in anything she had encountered before Montana. She could hear the creek from somewhere to the north, faint and steady, which was where she thought it probably actually came from. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. She kept her voice even. She was very good at keeping her voice even. She had been practicing it since she was old enough to understand that losing control of your voice in difficult conversations cost you ground you needed to hold. He was quiet, not the quiet of a man looking for an exit or composing a deflection. The quiet of a man choosing his words with the same deliberateness with which he chose everything else. Not because he was slow, but because he understood that words once spoken could not be taken back, and that the right word at the right time was worth far more than any number of approximate words deployed quickly. "You had been on that platform for 4 hours," he said. His voice was low and level, and it carried the quality of a statement that had been considered rather than constructed in the moment. "In the dark, alone, with your trunk and no one coming." He paused. Knowing who he was and what I knew about him wouldn't have changed what he'd done. It would have only added to it. She stood with this for a moment. She let herself think about what it would have meant in that specific moment on the platform. The cold and the dark and the silence, and the certainty that had just finished forming in her stomach, like a stone, to have also learned in that same moment that the man who hadn't come was not merely unreliable, but was a man who had done this before, had made agreements and not honored them, had perhaps made a practice of it. She thought about whether knowing that would have helped, and then she thought about something else, that he had made a decision about what she needed to know and when she needed to know it. That he had made that decision for her without consulting her, and that whatever the quality of his reasons, the decision itself had not been his to make. "That wasn't your decision," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't." He said it without qualification and without defense. He had done what he had done for the reason he had done it, and he was willing to hold that reason and that decision in the full light of her attention and let her see it clearly and determine what she thought of it. He did not apologize, which would have been a kind of deflection, a way of resolving the discomfort without actually engaging with it. He simply acknowledged the truth of what she had said. She stood on the porch and looked at him and felt something complicated moving in her. Not quite anger, not quite gratitude, not quite either of those things, but something that contained elements of both. He had taken a decision from her. He had also, in taking that decision, extended a consideration she had not been in a position to extend to herself that night. Both of these things were true. She was a person who worked with figures, and figures did not simplify inconveniently. They were what they were. "I need to finish looking through these records," she said. "Yes," he said. She went back inside. She put the letters at the bottom of the crate where she had found them. They had no place in the financial ledger she was building. She covered them with the other papers and went back to work. And the meadowlark on the corner of her desk looked at her with its head tilted as though it had heard everything and was still waiting to hear more. She did not bring up the letters again. He did not bring them up. But something had changed between them. Not badly, not in a way that made the mornings difficult or the silences strained, but in the way that a room changed when two people in it acknowledged without speaking it aloud that they were both aware of the same complicated truth. The coffee appeared each morning. The silence between them had a different quality now, not the silence of two strangers still learning the dimensions of each other's presence, but the silence of two people who had looked at something real together and come through it still in the same room. It was on a Thursday morning in the first week of August that the stranger arrived. She heard the horse before she saw anything coming up the ranch road at a pace that was faster than ordinary business required, pulled up sharply in the yard with a spray of dust. She came to the doorway of her workspace and saw a man she did not know dismounting in the middle of the yard and brushing road dust from his coat with the self-conscious movements of someone who wanted to appear to have arrived with more composure than he had. He was perhaps 45, well-dressed by Millbrook standards, with a hat that was new and boots that had not been broken in on ranch work. His face had the particular arrangement of features she associated with men who delivered unwelcome news for a living, a studied professional sympathy that sat on top of whatever the actual expression was, like a coating of varnish over wood you couldn't identify without scraping it away. Samuel came around from behind the barn. He stopped in the yard and looked at the man the way he looked at most things that appeared unexpectedly on his property, steadily without welcome or hostility, with the calm, total attention of a man taking accurate stock. The man introduced himself. He was an attorney, he said. He had come from Sweetwater County on behalf of a client. He had been informed that a Miss Willa Merritt was currently in residence at the Briggs property, and his client had a document that required her signature. Willa stepped out of the workspace doorway onto the porch. The attorney's expression when he saw her, the recalibration of it, the small professional adjustment, told her something before he said another word. He produced a document from inside his coat, folded in thirds, and held it toward her. His client, he explained with the measured practice delivery of a man who had given this explanation, or one very like it many times before, had retained him to resolve several outstanding administrative matters. One such matter pertained to a correspondence that had taken place in the preceding year between his client and a Miss Willa Merritt of Providence, Rhode Island. The document was a simple declaration. He used the word simple twice, confirming that the signatory had no claim of marital contract or financial entanglement with his client. His client's name, printed at the top of the folded document in clear black type, was Harlan Vale. She did not take the paper. She stood on the porch and looked at the attorney's face and understood with the abrupt and total clarity of something that had been just out of focus and has suddenly resolved several things at once. Harlan Vale was not dead. He was not missing. He was not a man who had intended to come and failed to arrive due to some accident or emergency. He was a man who was in Sweetwater County right now, actively engaged with an attorney, actively managing the situation he had created, actively working to close off the loose end that she represented. He had not simply failed to appear. He had decided not to appear. And having decided not to appear, he had moved on to the next step, which was to make sure she could not come after him. He had sent a man on horseback to ask her to sign a paper, making his life easier. She felt standing on that porch in the August sun, with the yard dust settling around the attorney's expensive boots, something that she would have called fury if she had been in the habit of naming her emotions in the heat of the moment. She was not. But she felt it, a cold, clear, very precise anger at the specific quality of what had been done to her, the calculation of it, the fact that she had been a problem to be managed rather than a person to be considered. "He's alive," she said. She said it to herself as much as to the attorney because she needed to hear the words take shape in the air and confirm that her understanding was correct. The attorney's expression shifted slightly. "My client's circumstances. He's alive," she said again. She said it evenly in the same tone she used when she corrected an arithmetic error in a ledger, not heated, just precise. "And he sent you here to get a signature." She was aware of Samuel taking 2 steps forward from where he had been standing. "You'll take that paper and leave this property." Samuel's voice had not risen. It had, if anything, lowered, settling into a register that was not a threat, but was something more substantial than a threat, the statement of a fact that was going to be true, regardless of what anyone thought about it. "You were not invited here." The attorney looked at Samuel Briggs standing in the yard in the August sun with his hands at his sides, a man who had built most of the structure around them with his own hands, and who was in the habit of doing whatever needed doing without the intervention of intermediaries, and he calculated something quickly and revised his next action accordingly. He folded the document. He put it back inside his coat. He mounted his horse with somewhat less dignity than he had dismounted and rode back down the ranch road at a pace that was technically not a retreat. Willa stood on the porch until the sound of the horse had entirely faded. The yard was very quiet. A fly moved in the heat near the water trough. The horses in the corral had watched the whole proceeding with the mild and curious attention of animals that had seen enough of human drama to have lost interest in it as a category of event. Then she went back into the workspace and sat down at the desk. She did not pick up her pen. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the 3 stacks of papers she had organized, and the ledger open on the desk, and the meadowlark on the corner, and she let herself feel fully and without management what the last 20 minutes had done to what she understood about her situation. He had always been alive. He had always been in Sweetwater County or somewhere like it, with a life that preceded and had nothing to do with her writing letters from inside that life, to women who placed advertisements in newspapers and then not coming, and then waiting to see if the problem would resolve itself, and when it didn't, sending an attorney. She thought about the creek that ran from the north in March and from the west in May. She thought about the novel she had not yet had any reason to think about. She thought about all the letters, all 6 months of them, their measured, careful, practical language, the voice of a man who was not given to exaggeration. She thought about the east-facing window and the morning sun for your bread. She sat with all of it for a long time, and the afternoon light moved across the wall, and outside she could hear Samuel moving around the property, the ordinary sounds of the ranch resuming after the interruption, and these sounds were somehow steadying, not because they resolved anything or answered any question, but because they were real, absolutely and unambiguously real, the sounds of actual work being done in an actual place by an actual person. She was still sitting at the desk when Samuel appeared in the doorway. He looked at her with the full, quiet attention she had come to expect from him, and she saw again the anger she had seen in the yard, deep and still and cold, held under careful control, the anger of a person feeling something on behalf of someone else rather than for themselves. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and then no. And then because honesty had always seemed to her more useful than its alternatives. "I don't know yet." He nodded. All 3 answers were apparently acceptable to him. That evening, he did not go inside after supper as he usually did. The ranch hands had gone to their bunkhouse, and the property had settled into its evening quiet, and when Willa came out of the workspace to wait for the hired man who brought her to and from town each day, she found Samuel in the porch chair, with his hands on his knees, looking at the mountains, in the particular way he looked at them at the end of long days, as though drawing from them something that replenished what the day had taken. She sat in the other chair. The silence between them was different from the silence they usually kept together. It had more weight to it, the weight of a day that had changed the shape of things. After a while, he began to talk. He talked about his parents. His father had come from Ohio with $60 and a team of horses and a practical, unromantic conviction that the Montana high country was good cattle country and that a man with sufficient patience and sufficient willingness to work could make something permanent there. He had been right, and he had spent his life proving it, building the ranch year by year the way you built anything worth building, slowly with attention, without cutting the corners that would cost you later. He had built the first 2 rooms of the house in the fall of 1871 and had added to them every year until he died. His mother had come from Indiana. Samuel said brought by the same kind of arrangement that had brought Willa to Millbrook, a correspondence with a man she had not met, a journey west on a train, an arrival at a station in an unfamiliar place. She had been 21. She had made the kitchen garden and the window boxes on the front porch and had planted the cottonwood by the creek, which was now taller than the barn. She had worked alongside his father for 20 years and had never, as far as Samuel could tell, regretted the decision that had brought her there. His mother had died in the winter of 1882. His father the following spring, as though the one had been the reason the other continued, and the reason gone there was nothing left to continue for. Samuel had been 26. He had buried them both in the Millbrook Cemetery and come back to the ranch and kept working, which was the thing you did when you were a person who worked, because the cattle did not stop needing care, because you were grieving and the fences did not hold themselves together in your absence. And the accounts here, he paused briefly with the dry awareness of a man making a point about himself that was not entirely comfortable. The accounts did not organize themselves. 7 years, Willa said quietly. 7 years, he confirmed. He did not say that it had been lonely. She would come to understand that this was a word he did not use, not because the feeling was absent, but because he did not have the habit of naming feelings the way some people did not have the habit of naming colors, not because they didn't see the colors, but because the naming of them seemed beside the point. But she heard the loneliness in the specific way he described the house in winter, the particular quality of quiet that a house had when you were the only person in it, which was different from all other kinds of quiet. The way he said it told her he had listened to that quiet for long enough to know exactly what made it different. She thought about her own quiets. The room on Benefit Street with the brick wall outside. The evenings after her father died when she had come home from the mill to an apartment that contained everything she owned and none of it spoke to her. The way she had made herself be content with solitude because the alternative was to admit she wasn't, and admitting it served no useful purpose when you were alone and could not change it. The hired man came at dusk, pulling up to the gate in his wagon with the punctual reliability that was the best thing about him. Willa stood and thanked Samuel for supper. They had been eating supper together at the kitchen table for several weeks now, a development that had not been discussed and had simply happened the way most things between them happened, and he nodded in his complete, unhurried way. She was at the gate when he spoke. "Miss Merritt?" She turned. He was still in the porch chair, his face in shadow, the last light of the evening above the mountains at his back. "The man from today," he said. "He won't be back." It was not a boast. It was not a threat, recalled in the telling. It was a simple statement of a thing that was true because he intended it to be true, and she understood that the intention was not an expression of power over the situation, but an expression of position, his position, which was between her and the direction from which that kind of thing came. "I know," she said. She meant it as more than simple agreement. She meant, "I understand what you are doing, and I understand that you are doing it without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement, and I am keeping track of it, and it is not nothing." She got into the wagon and rode back toward Millbrook through the August evening, the mountains going from gold to purple around her, the creek running alongside the road in the willow brush, running in whatever direction it actually ran. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early September, she arrived at the ranch to find Mrs. Aldrich already there. The older woman was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and an expression that Willa had learned over the months of living in her house to associate with the possession of significant information that was about to be shared. Samuel was at the table too with his own coffee, with the expression of a man who had already heard something and was waiting to see how it landed. Willa came in and sat down. Mrs. Aldrich was the postmistress of Millbrook, which meant that every letter that passed through the valley passed through her hands. She had, over the course of the previous afternoon, been doing the monthly sorting when she had noticed a letter. It was addressed to Martha Vale in Sweetwater County. The letter itself was nothing unusual. She had seen it arrive every month for at least 6 years, regular as the seasons. What was unusual was that she was looking at it today in September of 1889, while sitting at the kitchen table of Samuel Briggs's ranch across from a young woman from Providence who had arrived in Millbrook 3 months ago on the afternoon train and had been met by no one. Mrs. Aldrich said it plainly in the way she said everything that needed to be said plainly. Harlan Vale had a wife. He had had a wife for at least 6 years. The letters that went to Martha Vale in Sweetwater County every month were in the same handwriting as letters that had come through the Millbrook Post the previous winter, addressed to a Miss Willa Merritt at a street address in Providence, Rhode Island. Willa sat with this information and let it settle. He had been writing to her in December of 1888. He had been writing to Martha Vale every month for at least 6 years. He had written to Willa from inside a marriage, from inside a life that was already complete and occupied. And he had written with the voice of a man who had nothing and needed something, a man looking for a partner in a clear head and steady hands. He had written the sentence about the east-facing window while his wife was in Sweetwater County, presumably also receiving her monthly letter in the same handwriting. The architecture of it settled into something she could see whole. Not a man who had changed his mind, not a man who had tried and failed, a man who had never intended any of the things he had written, who had constructed the voice and the life in those letters. The way a set designer constructed a scene specifically, deliberately, for the purpose of creating an impression in the person who would be looking at it. The last of the structure she had built around Harlan Vale's letters came down. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, and this did not produce drama. But something that had been there, some last resistance or uncertainty, some part of her that had not quite finished hoping she was wrong about what she thought she knew, released. The way a muscle released after a very long time of being held, not with a sound, but with a kind of profound, deep settling. Samuel was watching her. He was not saying anything. He was not reaching across the table. He was simply there, watching her with the full, steady, undivided quality of his attention, and she felt it the way she felt the morning light through the workspace window, as something real, something that was actually present. Mrs. Aldrich collected her cup and her considerable self and went out through the front door, closing it with the precise quietness of a woman who understood exactly when two people needed to be left alone in a room. The kitchen was still. The morning light lay across the table in its long, pale rectangle. She sat at Samuel Briggs's kitchen table in the September light and did not say anything for a while. Neither did he. The creak made its sound from somewhere to the north. A horse shifted in the corral. The cottonwood his mother had planted moved in the first breath of morning wind. She thought about what she knew. She thought about what she was going to do. She thought about the attorney with his folded paper and about Harlan Vale sitting somewhere in Sweetwater County, waiting to find out whether the problem had been resolved and about what it would mean to pursue a legal remedy. The time and the money she did not have, the public record. It would create the story it would tell about her that she would not be able to control or correct once it was told. She thought about dignity, about what it meant and how it was held and what it cost when you lost it and what you had to be willing to do to keep it. "I want to write to her," she said, "to Martha Vale." Samuel looked at her steadily. "What will you say?" She had been thinking about this, already working it out in the back of her mind while the foreground was occupied with other thoughts. She was not angry at Martha Vale. She had no basis for anger at a woman who was, by all available evidence, as much a subject of Harlan Vale's arrangements as she was, if in a different register and with different consequences. She felt toward Martha Vale a kind of sober, pragmatic kinship, the feeling you had for someone you had never met, but with whom you shared an experience that most people were lucky enough never to have. "I'll tell her what happened," she said. "All of it. Simply, not to cause trouble. I don't know what she knows or what she's decided to know or not know, and that's her business, and I'm not going to make it mine. But she should hear it from me directly, before she hears it from someone else or doesn't hear it at all." He nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and held it without drinking from it, looking at her with the quality of attention that was, she had come to understand his way of showing that he was engaged, that what she was saying was being received by someone who was fully present and fully willing to hear it. "And the attorney's document," he said. She had been thinking about this too. The case for signing it was practical and clear. She had no enforceable claim against Harlan Vale. 6 months of letters, however specific, however detailed, however full of east-facing windows and cold-running creeks, were not a legal contract. A breach of promise claim required documentation and witnesses, and above all, money and time, and the outcome of such a claim, even if she prevailed, was public exposure and public humiliation in exchange for whatever nominal sum a court might be induced to award. She would be the jilted mail-order bride, the fool who had traveled halfway across the continent for a man she had never met. The story would define her in a way that nothing else she did would be able to undefine. The case against signing it was simple. She had not signed it, and she was not going to not because the paper gave her any practical advantage. She had examined this carefully and concluded it did not, but because Harlan Vale had sent a man on horseback to ask her to make his life easier, and she was not inclined to do that. Not at any price, and certainly not for free. "I won't sign it," she said. Something moved in Samuel's face, the same small, brief thing she had seen in the yard when the attorney turned his horse. The deep, contained satisfaction of a man who had hoped for a particular answer and received it. "No," he said. "I didn't expect you would." She wrote the letter to Martha Vale that afternoon at her desk in the workspace with the meadowlark watching and the sounds of the ranch coming through the open door in the warm September air. She wrote it 3 times before she was satisfied. The first version was too long and too explanatory a letter that spent too much of its effort on context and not enough on the essential facts. The second version was too careful, the language hedged in ways that were polite, and were also dishonest in the way that excessive care was always a little dishonest. She was managing the other person's reaction rather than simply telling them the truth. The third version was a single page written in the same hand she used for the ledgers, each fact in its proper place. Nothing embellished and nothing withheld. She told Martha Vale what had happened, the advertisement, the letters, the east-facing window. She included this because it was specific and because it mattered not to her pride, but to her understanding of what Harlan Vale was. The platform in the dark, the trunk, the empty platform. She told it plainly without self-pity and without accusation, in the tone of a person delivering an accounting rather than a grievance. She said at the end that she did not know what Martha Vale knew or what she had decided about her own situation, and that this was entirely her own business. She said she thought a woman in her position deserved to hear this from the person it had happened to. She said she wished her well, and she did. She gave the envelope to Mrs. Aldrich in the morning and then went back to the ledgers and did not look at the door for the wagon to Sweetwater County departing. The accounts were close to finished. She had known this for a week, the way you knew the end of a long road was close, when you could see the change in the landscape ahead, the way the distance was beginning to have a different quality. She had been working toward this point for 3 months, and she could see it from where she was now. 2, perhaps 3 more days of work, and the final figures would close, and the 3 ledgers would be complete and accurate and coherent, and her reason for being at the ranch would be finished. She turned this fact over in her mind on the wagon rides to and from town, on the afternoons when the work had a meditative quality and part of her attention could be elsewhere. She was not in the habit of sentimentality. She had no intention of beginning now. But honesty, and she was above all things honest with herself, because dishonesty with yourself was the most expensive kind. Honesty required her to acknowledge that the ranch had become something she did not have a clean word for. Not home, not yet, she was careful with that word, but something close to the direction of home. The particular smell of the pines in the cool of the morning when the wagon turned north from the main road. The sound of the creek from the open door in the afternoons. The meadowlark on the corner of the desk. The way the light came through the east window at the specific angle of September mornings and fell across the ledgers and made the columns briefly luminous. The coffee. Every morning without fail, without comment, without requiring acknowledgement, the coffee on the corner of her desk. She finished the accounts on the last Friday of September. She sent the hired man back and told him she would walk, which was not practical and was also necessary because she wanted to finish in the proper way in her own time without the constraint of someone waiting at the gate. She closed the final column at 5:30. She set her pen in its rest and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of finished work, which was different from all other quiets. Then she stacked the 3 ledgers and carried them out to the porch. Samuel was closing the corral gate when he saw her come out. He came across the yard with his long, unhurried stride and came up the porch steps and took the ledgers from her the same way he had taken her trunk, simply, directly, without ceremony. He opened the top ledger and turned the pages slowly, not reading every figure, but taking in the quality of the work, the clean columns, the consistent hand, the order that had been made. He looked at it for a long time. "I don't know what to say," he said. "Then don't say anything," she said. He looked up from the ledger at her. The evening light was behind him, the September sky above the western mountains, going through its colors, the amber and rose and deep burning gold of high country evenings that she had stopped trying to describe because the words were not adequate. "The work is finished," he said. "Yes." The words sat between them. The creek made its sound. A horse blew in the corral. The evening was very still in the way that mountain evenings were still when the wind had gone and the animals had settled and the light was doing the last of what it intended to do for the day. He closed the ledger. "There are other things," he said. He was looking at the cover of the ledger, not at her. "That need attention." She waited. "The pantry hasn't been organized since my mother died," he said. "And the mending." He said this last word as though it were a separate thought, though it was not. "There is considerable mending on a working ranch." There usually is, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the ledger. All right, she said. I'll stay. He looked up and for a moment, just a moment, the space of a breath, something crossed his face that was entirely unguarded, a relief so deep and unperformed that it was almost uncomfortable to witness the way very honest things were sometimes uncomfortable to witness. As if he had been waiting for that answer for longer than the last 5 minutes. He nodded once, went inside. She stood on the porch a moment longer, looking at the last of the light over the mountains, and then went home to Mrs. Aldrich's. The letter from Martha Vale arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of October. Willa recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she had fully read the return address. A deliberate, careful hand, the letters formed with the precision of someone who had come to literacy seriously and practiced it with intent. She carried the letter upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Martha Vale wrote the way she apparently did most things, directly with economy, without the decorative preamble that women were often trained to put at the beginning of letters as a kind of social cushioning. She thanked Willa for writing. She said she had known for some time that her husband was not the man she had believed she was marrying, had come to know it the way you came to know most important truths about the people you lived with gradually. And then all at once, one small incongruity compounding another, until the picture they made together was impossible to look at and still call something else. She had filed papers with the county court in August. The process was underway. And then near the bottom of the letter, a paragraph. Martha Vale had found among her husband's possessions a small paperback novel published in 1871. She had found it because she had decided to look, really look, the way you looked when you had stopped making accommodations for what you might find. The novel was a sentimental story about frontier life long out of print, the kind of book that appeared in the 25-cent bins of train station newsstands and was sold to travelers wanting something to pass the time. She had found it in a drawer worn at the spine, with one page turned down at the corner. On that page there was a passage, a woman at a kitchen window in the early morning light coming in from the east, bread rising on the counter. The east-facing window, the morning sun for your bread. He had not written it. He had read it in a novel published 18 years earlier, and copied it into a letter as though it were something he had lived and seen and thought of specifically for the person he was writing to. Martha Vale had also found in the same drawer a small notebook. In the notebook were the names and addresses of 4 women in 4 different states with dates beside each name. The dates were the dates of first contact. Willa's name was the 3rd on the list. Willa set the letter on the bed beside her and looked at the east-facing window of her room at Mrs. Aldrich's boarding house. The morning light came through it every day and fell across the floor in its long, pale rectangle. It had done this every morning since she arrived. It would do it tomorrow. It did it because the window faced east and the sun rose in the east, and this was not a promise or a feature or a selling point, but simply a fact of orientation, a consequence of which direction the wall happened to face. She thought about the sentence. The kitchen window faces east. You will have the morning sun for your bread. She thought about how many times she had read it. She thought about the specific quality of comfort it had given her, the warmth of it, how precisely it had entered the locked part of her and opened it. She thought about the fact that this sentence had been in a 25-cent novel for 18 years before Harlan Vale found it and decided to use it. A key cut from someone else's lock carried around to see which doors it would open. It had opened hers. She sat with this for a long time, not moving, not making a sound, just sitting with the letter on the bed beside her and the window in front of her, and the specific feeling of understanding something completely for the first time. What surprised her, and she examined her own surprise with the same careful attention she brought to everything that was worth understanding, was that the anger, though present, was not the largest thing she felt. There was anger, real anger, cold and clean and precise, aimed at the specific cruelty of what had been done to her and to the other women whose names were in the notebook, women who had wanted nothing complicated, who had asked for nothing more than a decent life, and had been willing to be brave about going to find it, and who had been targeted specifically because of that willingness. That anger was real and it was hers, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't there. But underneath it or alongside it was something else. A stillness, a sense of ground. She was in Montana. She was in Millbrook. She was in a small, clean, east-facing room in a boarding house run by a woman who had not asked a single intrusive question in the 3.5 months she had lived there. And tomorrow morning, she would get in a wagon and ride 5 miles north to a ranch where 3 years of financial chaos had been replaced by 3 clean ledgers, and where a tin cup of coffee would be on the corner of a desk, and a meadowlark carved from pale wood would be watching from beside it. And the work she would do that day would matter to a person who deserved to have it done well. Harlan Vale had sent her here with a lie, but here was where she was, and here was real. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the bottom of her trunk under her mother's Bible, which was where she kept the things that were important and finished. She went downstairs and helped Mrs. Aldrich with the evening dishes and did not talk about the letter and Mrs. Aldrich did not ask. She told Samuel in the morning. She told him on the porch before she went to the workspace in the early light that was coming in over the lower hills to the east, the ranch quiet around them, with the particular quality of September mornings, when the season had turned and the air carried the first suggestions of what was coming. She told him about the novel, about the page turned down at the corner, about the names in the notebook. He listened without interrupting, without shifting in his chair, without any of the small movements that people made when they were listening and also thinking about what they were going to say. He simply listened fully until she was done. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. His jaw was set in the way it's set when he was containing something. 4 women, he said. At least, she said, that she found. He was quiet again. The anger was there, she could see it, the same deep, cold, still thing she had seen in the yard with the attorney. But it did not perform itself. He did not offer to do anything about it. He seemed to understand with an accuracy that she found remarkable in a man who was not practiced in discussing feelings, that this anger was hers to carry and her decision to act on or not, and that what she had come to tell him was not a request for intervention, but something else, the need to say it out loud to someone who would receive it honestly. The sentence about the window, she said. He looked at her. The east-facing window, she said. I built quite a lot on that sentence. He looked at her the way he had looked at the meadowlark when he was carving it, with the full, precise attention of someone making something that mattered and knowing it. I know you did, he said. It wasn't real, she said. No, he said. It wasn't. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the mountains. The light was coming over the lower ridges now, the first direct sun of the day touching the upper slopes of the peaks to the west and turning them gold against the blue. But the window in the boarding house is real, she said carefully. It faces east. The light comes through it every morning. She paused. And the workspace window faces east. She looked at him. I noticed that the first day. He was very still. I didn't plan it, he said. His voice was quiet and certain. The room was a storeroom. The window is where it is because of how the house is laid out. I never thought about which direction it faced. I know, she said. That's exactly what I mean. She stood and went inside and began work on the pantry, which she had been meaning to address for weeks. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. She was aware of him standing on the porch for a while after she went in, standing still in the way he stood when he was thinking about something, and then she heard his boot on the step, and he went to the barn, and the morning went on, and the light moved across the kitchen floor in its slow, reliable arc. The pantry took 3 days. It was in the condition she had expected, the condition of a space managed by a man who was skilled at every form of outdoor work and who had never developed the habit of interior organization. Spices shelved alongside bolts, preserves from 3 different years mixed together without dates, a full crock of lard wedged behind a box of horseshoe nails. She worked through it methodically, pulling everything out and sorting it by category, and then returning it in an order that made sense where things could be found by someone who had not put them there. She began to cook the evening meal. This had not been discussed. It had simply happened the way the coffee had happened, One evening she stayed later than usual, and there were things in the kitchen that needed doing, and she did them, and he came in from the range at dusk and sat down at the table and ate what she had made, and they talked or did not talk in the easy, comfortable way of two people who had learned each other's silences well enough to be at ease in them. She mended his shirts, 7 of them each with the specific and various damage of hard physical work tears, at the shoulder-worn elbows, lost buttons, a rent along a seam where the fabric had simply given up. She repaired them with the neat small stitches of someone who took this kind of work seriously and folded them and left them on the chair inside the door. The house was changing in the way that houses change when someone was paying attention to them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but day by day. The small accumulation of care making itself felt in the quality of the air, the order of the rooms, the sense that things were in their right places. She put a pot of red geraniums on the porch railing, the brightest possible color against the weathered gray of the wood, a small, deliberate claim on this space. He did not mention the geraniums, but she watched from the workspace window one morning early before he thought anyone was watching as he watered them with a tin cup before going to the barn, carefully, steadily making sure the water went to the roots. She turned back to her work without saying anything. October came in with cold mornings and golden afternoons. The aspens on the slopes above the ranch turned bright yellow and trembling, the light changing as the season changed into something lower and more amber and more considered. On the second Friday of October, he came in for supper earlier than usual. She was at the stove. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, and she knew from the way he was standing the particular quality of his stillness, which was different from his ordinary stillness, that something was different about this evening. "Willa," he said. She turned. He used her given name carefully and infrequently, the way he used everything that mattered. Not casually, not by habit, but with the deliberateness of someone who understood that a name was not a small thing, that it was a specific acknowledgement of a specific person, and that the moment you said it, you were claiming a kind of familiarity that could not be taken back. She set the spoon on the rest beside the stove. She gave him her full attention. It was what the moment required. He turned his hat in his hands. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and the look was direct and complete, the look he gave things that mattered. "This house," he said. He stopped. He started again. 7 years in this house by myself. I knew what that was. I understood it. I had gotten to where I didn't think about it much anymore. He paused. I didn't know what I was missing until there was something to compare it to. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood by the creek, the tree his mother had planted taller now than the barn, and the sound of it came through the walls, soft and specific and alive. "I'm not a man who has fine words," he said. "I know that about myself. I have no sentences about kitchen windows to offer you." He said this without apology and without embarrassment, as a simple and accurate report of fact. "I have no poetry. What I have is this ranch, which is hard work and a long way from everything you knew, and I have myself, which I won't recommend without reservation because I'm slow to speak and I take up considerable room in a silence, and I've been alone long enough that my habits are fixed in ways that won't always be easy to live with." He looked at her steadily. "What I'm asking," he said, "is whether you would stay. Not as my bookkeeper, not as the woman who cooks my supper and mends my shirts." He looked at her with the full, undivided, unsentimental attention that was the thing she trusted most about him. "As my wife." The kitchen held the moment. She thought about December in Providence, the writing desk on Benefit Street, and the first snow of the season, and the advertisement she had written and rewritten, looking for the words that would be honest without being desperate. The hope she had carried west like something breakable, warm and specific and particular, a woman at a kitchen window with the morning sun coming in. She thought about a creek that ran from 2 directions, an attorney with a folded paper, a notebook with her name written third on a list. She thought about a tin cup of coffee on the corner of a desk every morning for 3 months, a meadowlark carved from pale wood and left without explanation, red geraniums watered early in the morning before anyone was watching, 7 shirts mended and folded on a chair, She thought about a man who on the night she arrived had picked up a stranger's trunk in the dark and made no comment about what he knew, and had walked her to a lighted door and paid for her roof and gone back into the dark without asking for anything in return. "You are slow to speak," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you take up considerable room in a silence." "I have been told this," he said. "I've noticed it myself," she said. She paused, considering the right word the way she was learning to consider words the way he had taught her by example without meaning to teach her anything, and found it sufficient. Something happened in his face, not a smile, not yet, but the place a smile came from, lit by something that was real and unhurried and had been waiting a long time. "Yes," she said, "I will stay, as your wife." He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he had needed to hear aloud to be fully certain of. He did not cross the kitchen. He did not take her hands. He put his hat on the hook beside the door and came to the table and sat down, and she turned back to the stove, and they moved around the kitchen in the easy, practiced way of two people who had long since learned where the other one would be. The night before the wedding, she woke before dawn. She lay in the dark of her room at Mrs. Aldrich's and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sleeping house and thought about morning. She got up, put on her wrap, went downstairs in the dark and built up the stove and put the kettle on and stood in the kitchen waiting for the water to boil. The light came gradually, the way light always came in the mountain country, not all at once but in stages, the sky outside the east-facing window above the sink, going from absolute dark to the color of very deep water. And then from that to pewter, and then as the kettle began to steam, the first direct light of the morning sun came through the glass and fell across the kitchen floor in a long, pale blade that widened as she watched. She stood in it. She thought about the sentence, "The kitchen window faces east. You will have the morning sun for your bread." She said it quietly to herself in the empty kitchen, the words she had read perhaps 200 times, the words that had been in a 25-cent novel for 18 years, before they were used to open a door they were never meant to open. She thought about the workspace at the ranch, the window on the east wall, the morning light that came through it at the same angle at the same hour, and fell across the ledgers and lit the pale wood of the meadowlark, and made the coffee steam in the tin cup on the corner of the desk. No one had promised her that window. No one had written about it in a letter. No one had included it in a description of the ranch. It had not been offered as evidence of anything or used to create any impression in any person. It was simply a window in a wall of a house built by a man who had not thought about which direction it faced, only about where it needed to be for the room to function. It faced east because east was the direction it faced. The light came through it because the light came through east-facing windows in the morning, as it had always done and would always do, regardless of what anyone wrote about it in any letter. Some things were true without anyone needing to say so. She made the coffee the way Samuel made it, black and strong. No concessions, and stood at the east-facing window of Mrs. Aldrich's kitchen and watched the light come fully into the valley and thought about the difference between what was written and what was true and understood, standing there in the specific light of a specific October morning in Montana that she had traveled 3,000 miles in the wrong direction and arrived precisely where she was supposed to be. They were married on the second Saturday of October 1889 in the small white church at the end of Millbrook's Main Street. Mrs. Aldrich stood as witness in her good black dress with a cluster of dried flowers on the lapel, and she wept without embarrassment or apology, dabbing at her eyes with a white handkerchief, while maintaining throughout the expression of a woman who had predicted this outcome and was satisfied to find herself correct. Willa wore the blue dress she had made herself in the weeks after finishing the ledgers. Not a wedding dress, a good dress, well cut and practical, and the color of early morning sky before the sun came fully over the ridge. She carried no flowers. She had thought about it and decided it was not a thing she needed. Samuel wore his best suit of dark wool, slightly too warm for October, but pressed and immaculate. He stood at the front of the church with the minister and watched her come up the aisle and did not look away. Not for a moment, with the full and unhurried attention of a man who had made a decision and was not in the habit of reconsidering his decisions once he was certain of them. The whole of Millbrook had come, They filled the church and overflowed onto the steps, and they were there. Willa understood this watching them as she came up the aisle, not because it was a spectacle, but because it was a story that had completed itself in a way that satisfied something they had all been watching without quite knowing they were watching it. The stranger on the platform in the dark. The man who had paid her first week without a word and ridden away. The months on the ranch road back and forth, back and forth. People in small places paid close attention to the stories that unfolded among them, and this one had been watched with the patience of people who understood that some stories took the time they took, and its ending felt to those who had watched it not merely happy but earned. Samuel put the ring on her finger, plain gold, simple and solid and correct, bought from the jeweler in Billings, and said the words the minister asked him to say. And she said hers, and the church was very quiet while they said them, and then it was done. They were what they had been moving towards since the night on the platform, which was to say they were themselves, but together, which was the only kind of together that was worth the name. 5 years later, in the October of 1894, the evening light came through the west-facing windows of the ranch house. In that particular way, it had an October low and amber and long, making the whole front room glow as though something inside it were burning quietly and warmly. Willa sat on the porch in the rocking chair Samuel had built for her in the spring. A shirt in her lap, not his, too small for that, the shirt of their son Thomas, who was 4 years old, and who had recently developed a comprehensive talent for destroying his clothing that had elevated mending from an occasional task to a near-daily requirement. Thomas himself was in the yard engaged in a negotiation with a chicken over possession of an object she could not identify from the porch. He was conducting the negotiation at full volume with the earnest conviction of someone who had not yet learned that chickens did not negotiate and would not be learning it today if he could help it. Their daughter June was 2 years old, sitting at Willa's feet with the focused interior quality of very young children who are doing something they consider important. She was arranging a collection of small stones in a line that had a logic she alone understood. She had her father's eyes, gray and steady, and already at 2 years old, directed at the world with a quality of attention that made Willa think she was going to be the kind of person who noticed everything and said only what mattered. Samuel came around from the side of the house and stopped when he saw Thomas and the chicken. He watched for a moment with the expression he wore when something was amusing that he was not going to confirm was amusing. "Thomas," he said. Thomas looked up. The chicken immediately reassessed its position and departed. "She started it," Thomas said. "I expect she did," Samuel said. "Come wash your hands." Thomas considered arguing. He looked at his father's face and made the calculation that experience had taught him to make quickly and came to wash his hands. Samuel's hand rested briefly on the top of the boy's head as they passed each other, the most natural gesture in the world. Unrehearsed, unnoticed by either of them, the gesture of a father who had not grown up with much tenderness and had decided without making a project of it to be a different kind of father than the kind he had imagined fathers to be. He came up the porch steps and sat in the chair beside her. He was tired in the way he was tired in October when the work of preparing the ranch for winter was at its most demanding. A deep tiredness that came from the bones outward, the kind that was not distress, but the natural consequence of a body that had worked hard and steadily all day at things that mattered. He carried it without complaint the way he carried everything as a simple fact of his life. He reached over and tucked a strand of her hair back from her face. His touch easy and unremarkable in the way that 5 years of daily life made touch easy and unremarkable. Not passionate in the acute temporary sense, but something more durable, the touch of a hand that knew exactly what it was touching and intended to go on knowing it. "Long day," she said. "Not so long," he said. June looked up from her stones, observed her parents with the grave attention she brought to everything, and returned to her stones. Thomas came back from washing his hands and immediately began presenting his case against the chicken to his father with the confidence of someone who believed that a fresh audience was all his argument had been lacking. Willa stitched and listened to her son with part of her attention and gave the rest to the evening, the light fading over the western peaks, the creek making its sound from the bend at the north end of the property, the cottonwood Samuel's mother had planted swaying in the first breath of the evening wind. She thought, as she sometimes did at this hour, about Providence, about the room on Benefit Street and the writing desk, and the first snow, and the advertisement she had composed so carefully, looking for words that were honest without being pathetic. She thought about the girl who had read 10 words in a letter and built a future on them. And she felt for that girl, not pity, not condescension, but the specific tenderness you felt for someone who had been brave in a difficult situation, even if the bravery had been aimed in the wrong direction. She had been 23 and alone, and in possession of a talent for figures and a distrust of pretty words. And she had looked at her situation clearly and decided to do something about it, which was the most she could have done, and more than most people did. And the doing had brought her here. "Willa," Samuel said. She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains in the way he looked at them at the end of days, drawing from them whatever the mountains gave to a man who had been looking at them long enough to know what they had to offer. "I've been thinking," he said, "about adding a room on the east side. The children will need more space before long." She looked at him. "A room on the east side. Gets good light in the morning," he said. "Practical, simple. The statement of a man who knew what an east-facing room did in the morning because he lived in one and had been living in one long enough to know it as a fact rather than a promise." She felt something move through her, the same thing she had felt in the kitchen at Mrs. Aldrich's on the morning before the wedding, standing in the east light with the coffee. The sense of a circle completing itself, a long arc coming back around to its own beginning, not with ceremony, but with the quiet, matter-of-fact satisfaction of a column that had finally balanced. The lie that had brought her here had told the truth about one thing. There was morning light to be had in the high country of Montana, real and unhurried, coming through windows that faced the actual east. No one needed to steal it from a novel. No one needed to promise it in a letter written from inside a life that had nothing to do with the person reading the letter. It was simply there every morning for anyone patient and honest enough to build their life in its direction. She looked at her husband, the gray at his temples that had not been there 5 years ago, and the lines at the corners of his eyes that had deepened, the hands that had made the meadowlark and built the rocking chair she was sitting in and loaded her trunk onto a mule in the dark of a June night, and had held hers in the small white church with a plain gold ring and no poetry, with only the complete and unhurried attention of a man who did not say things he did not mean. "A room on the east side," she said. "Yes." Thomas had stopped making his case against the chicken. He had drifted to his father's knee and was leaning against it with his eyes going heavy in the way of a 4-year-old at the end of a long day, his whole body slowly giving up the argument with sleep that had been going on for the past half hour. Samuel's hand came to rest on the back of the boy's head with the same unrehearsed naturalness as before. June had finished her arrangement of stones. She looked at it with the critical satisfaction of someone who has completed something according to a standard that exists entirely inside themselves. Then she leaned against Willa's foot and closed her eyes. The evening light finished its last performance above the western peaks and was gone, and the sky went from gold to rose to the deep indigo that came before full dark, and the first stars appeared above the eastern hills, the same stars she had seen on the platform, the same stars that had moved in their slow arc above the east-facing window of the boarding house on her first night in Millbrook, bright and hard and close in the high-altitude air. The same stars, a different life. Not the life she had imagined in December in the dark, in a rented room facing a brick wall. Better than that life in every way that could be counted, and in several ways that could not. Because it was hers. Not a promise written down. Not a sentence taken from a novel and used to open a door. Not a description composed by someone who did not know which direction his own creek ran. But a life assembled from true things, one small and certain thing at a time, by a woman who had learned in the space of 4 months on a 5-mile stretch of Montana road between a dark platform in June and a small white church in October to tell the difference between what was written and what was real. Samuel reached over in the dark and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused and warm, and it held hers with the quiet, certain ease of a hand that had decided it was exactly where it was supposed to be. The house behind them was lit. The children were warm against them. The creak made its sound from the north. It was not an empty house.